Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to what I believe is going to be a great panel discussion, community conversation, belonging, reclaiming queer with Lakeshore's United Visionaries. Welcome, panelists. Happy solstice, happy Pride Month, and happy panel. Great having you here. I'm going to turn things over to our panel pretty much quickly, take myself out of the picture. But before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone of a couple things. As this is a community conversation, it would be great to have as much participation from people watching as possible. So type in your questions and comments into the comments box on either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll get to those eventually, as many things as get in. With that in mind, though, with asking questions and comments, just a couple things. Remember to be respectful. You don't always have to agree with everything. You don't even have to understand everything that's being said. But that leads into the next thing, is that you should listen as well. Just listen and be respectful, and nothing bad can come from that. And great conversations can grow out of that. So without further ado, I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves. Take myself out of the picture. That's way too much Tim Kaczynski. And Megan, why don't you kick things off?
My name is Megan Marchant. My pronouns are they, them. I have been a part of Love for a year and a half now, maybe a little bit more. I'm currently the secretary.
All right. Thank you, Megan. And Natasha, I believe.
Yep. Hi, I'm Natasha Khan, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the current president of Lakeshore's United Visionaries, and I've been a part of Love since pretty much the beginning.
Welcome. And Sonia?
I am Sonia Vasquez, and I am a board member of Love, and I, like Natasha, have been a part of Love since pretty much the beginning. And yeah, that's about it for me.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump right in with your PowerPoint presentation. And also, just remember, questions and comments, get them in all throughout, and we will get to them eventually. So here we go.
So the title of this discussion tonight is Belonging, Reclaiming Queer. And tonight we'll kind of go through some terminology. We'll talk about queer culture, the word queer, and what that all means. So like Tim said, we welcome questions and conversations surrounding this topic tonight. Next one. So starting with reclaiming queer. So queer is a term people often use to express a spectrum of identities and orientations that are counter to the mainstream. So queer is often used as a catch-all to include people of a lot of different identities in the LGBTQ community, including sexual orientations and gender identities and things like that. So the term has a history, as most people know, as a slur, but it also has been reclaimed in the last, I would say, 20 years, slowly, by the LGBTQ community. So the first time that the word queer was documented in use as an identifier for someone are in the documents relating to the trial and that led to the imprisonment and death of Oscar Wilde. And in those documents, when you read through those, the word queer isn't used as a derogatory slur. It's used by Wilde and his one of his partners talking about themselves. So it wasn't always a slur. And as the years went on, it peaked as a slur, starting in the 50s and going through the 70s. And then by the 80s, the queer community was reclaiming it. Queer Nation, which is known as ACT UP, which was an HIV/AIDS group, started using it in their banners. Then there was the TV show Queer as Folk, and then Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. We all know that. So it really has had an evolution back and forth between its meanings and its connotation to the LGBTQ community.
So I'm going to go through some terminology, so bear with me. So we're just going to go right straight through the LGBTQIA+. So for L is for lesbian, a woman who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to other women. Gay is used in some cultural settings to represent men who are attracted to men in a romantic, sexual, and or emotional sense. B is for bisexual, a person emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to more than one gender, though not simultaneously in the same way or to the same degree. T is for transgender, an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the same sex they were assigned at birth. Being transgender does not imply any specific sexual orientation. Therefore, transgender people may identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. Queer/questioning. Megan already went over queer, so I'll go over questioning. It's a term used to describe people who are in the process of exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. I is for intersex. Intersex people are born with a variety of differences in their sex traits and reproductive anatomy. There is a wide variety of difference among intersex variations, including differences in genitalia, chromosomes, gonads, internal sex organs, hormone production, hormone release, and other secondary sex traits. A is for asexual, agender, aromantic, and ally. So asexual, often called ace for short, refers to a complete or partial lack of sexual attraction or lack of interest in sexual activity with others. Asexuality exists on a spectrum, and asexual people may experience no, little, or conditional sexual attraction. Agender is a person with no or very little connection to gender, no personal alignment with the concept of either man or woman, and or someone who sees themselves as existing without gender. An aromantic is a person who experiences little or no romantic attraction to others and or has a lack of interest in romantic relationships or behavior. And lastly, ally is a term used to describe someone who is actively supportive of LGBTQ plus people and encompasses straight and cisgender allies, as well as those within the LGBT plus community who support each other. Go to the next slide. And then we have a few more terms. So non-binary is an adjective describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside these categories. Pansexual describes someone who has the potential for emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to people of any gender, though not necessarily simultaneously in the same way or to the same degree. And then we have assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth for those acronyms. And then lastly, we have cisgender or cis, is a person whose sense of personal identity or gender does not correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth. And then we have a bunch of flag examples up there too. Then go to the next slide.
All right. So getting into queer culture. So we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about queer culture and what like different sort of things are involved within the culture. We picked just 3 things. Obviously, there's more to the culture than these 3 things. But I think these are 3 major things that are kind of known to people that are not in the queer community, but also somewhat not known. So starting with drag. A lot of people are familiar with drag, but we just kind of wanted to touch on what is drag and who does drag. So drag essentially is, coming from dressing up in, stereotypically different gender outfits, makeup, hair, anything to do with that. And who does drag, it can really be anyone. We most commonly see men doing drag. Cis men usually doing drag, but there are plenty of trans folks that do drag. There are plenty of women that do drag. non-binary people that do drag. Like I said, we often see a lot of drag queens as being, a female drag queen or a feminine drag queen. But we sometimes forget that there can also be drag kings, where it's often women or feminine people dressing up as men or more masculine folks. And as we can see down in the corner here, we have a little image of a drag queen who is Jinx Monsoon, and she is from the popular show RuPaul's Drag Race. So that's where a lot of people tend to know drag queens from, is RuPaul's Drag Race. It's pretty popular amongst a lot of people, not necessarily just in the queer community. So she is widely known for that, for being on RuPaul's Drag Race. But in that image, she's also playing Judy Garland. So moving into the next section here, queer icons. And so the reason we, had that photo of Jinx Monsoon playing Judy Garland is because we wanted to talk also about Judy Garland herself as a queer icon. And so there's sort of a phenomenon, I guess, of like, iconic people to queer folks or queer culture. It's sort of like certain people just have a sort of factor to them where they've kind of become iconic within the culture. And Judy Garland is one of them. And this started, way back when Judy Garland was young and still living. And so I think she became popular mostly from obviously her movies, just herself in general, her personality, her looks. So like a lot about her just really, really attracted the queer community for some reason. And so her name was often used as a sort of secret kind of code word, yeah. Where folks would ask each other if they're a friend of Dorothy. And that was sort of code for saying like, are you queer? Are you part of the community? And people would kind of be able to tell then without directly asking somebody if they're queer, because especially when this was being used more often, it was a lot scarier to just outright ask somebody, even though at our times right now there are times where we can be unsafe and asking somebody can be unsafe. At that time it was probably a little bit more scary. So Judy Garland, and then the next person that we have on here is Sappho of Lesbos. So Sappho was a Greek poet in ancient times, and she is where the term sapphic comes from. So maybe one of the terms we should have included in our terminology list. But sapphic is essentially just meaning women loving women, or feminine people loving feminine people, where, lesbian relationships, types of things like that. And Lesbos is where she's from, and also where the term lesbian comes from. So Sappho would write poems often about her love interests who were women. There's imagery depicting her and depicting her with women. And so ever since, more discovery into her and those terms coming from Sappho and from Lesbos, she's sort of become an icon and still is an icon to the queer community today. And then we have Frida Kahlo, which Frida Kahlo is sort of known a little bit more, I would say, not as maybe well known as Sappho of Lesbos or Judy Garland, but she's still known as a bisexual icon. She had relationships, obviously, with Diego Rivera. She also had relationships with Georgia O'Keeffe and other men and women in her life. So for that, she's also known as a bisexual icon. And then I'm going to go into queer fashion. So, so queer fashion is, I think, just another massive sort of subject when it comes to queer culture. There's so much, and it gets so niche, to the point where, like, you know, the average person probably wouldn't know that, like, that certain things are specifically this, sexuality's sort of niche thing. But for example, cuffs are like when you cuff your pants or you cuff the shoulder of your shirt, things like that, commonly known more contemporarily, so often with like millennials, younger folks, cuffs are seen as a bisexual sort of iconic fashion thing. I like to give Megan some crap for cuffing their pants, because
Because I'm a lesbian and I'm appropriating bi culture.
they're appropriating bisexual culture. But totally jokes. Anybody can wear cuffs.
Anybody can cuff.
It doesn't mean that you're bisexual. It doesn't mean you're appropriating anything. It's okay. But we like to joke. So, but yeah. So cuffs, just one thing that's considered, canon bisexual fashion. Carabiners are an iconic symbol of somebody possibly being a lesbian. And I know maybe not everybody knows what a carabiner is, but it's like those little hook things that you use in climbing, or to like put your keys on. They're like tended like to be seen as lesbian.
They were identifiers in the community. So yeah. there were little pockets of subculture that grew up around all of these identifiers, so before Tinder and before, all the apps and everything, if you were in a gay bar, and you saw, some of these items, you would know that, oh, that person, is showing that their identifiers. So.
And to kind of get more specific into that, flagging. So flagging is essentially what Megan just pointed out, different ways of basically queer people telling other queer people that they're queer, because you can't always tell. Some people say, certain people look a certain way and you can tell that they're, part of the community. You can't always tell. And so sometimes some queer people choose to flag in different ways. And one of the prominent ways, like historically, that people have flagged is with bandanas. So you can see in the center photo there that people would have bandanas hanging out of their pockets to flag different things within the community. And I won't get into the specific types of colors and flagging, but you can definitely research that if you're interested. But as I was saying, this is, one of the types of flagging. There's plenty more types of flagging that people do within the community. For example, people use rings, like putting rings on a certain finger or different types of rings. Flowers are a big one. So like pansies, violets, those specific flowers having meaning within the queer community, and pins as well. I don't know if any of you have ever seen or visited the PFLAG booth at markets or at any other events. They have lots of pins and have different sayings and things on them. So that's, considered another form of flagging as well. And then lastly, just because I missed it, I want to point out the first photo there is looks like a protest of some sort or a march for lesbians, and somebody is dressed up as Sappho. So just wanted to point that out before we move on. But we can go on.
Well, I just want to say that the whole reason that we're going through all of this and talking about these things is in the context of belonging. And so what these things did. So, being a participant in drag creates a sense of belonging in a culture, in a community. Having these icons creates a sense of belonging. Having these queer fashion indicators, right? It created a sense of belonging, so that the queer community had all of those things, and it kind of felt it was protective against the greater community, right? Because you'd say, "Are you a friend of Dorothy?" You see that someone, is cuffing, and you could be, you could surmise a conclusion, but also I think that having the word queer be reclaimed has been powerful, because most different factions of the LGBTQ plus community have started adopting that as an identifier, and in some way are accepting that is a synonym for LGBTQIA plus, and that creates a sense of community, which creates a sense of belonging.
And I think just to add to that, I think another reason why queer culture is so expansive at this point in time is also because queer people needed to have their own culture. Like what Megan was saying, it's about belonging, and it's about having your own culture, having your own sense of self and identity, especially because a lot of queer people, couldn't be in other types of culture, or were not allowed to be, or removed, or considered not welcome in certain cultures or certain societal aspects. So to create your own culture and it be so expansive, I think, is a really beautiful thing, but it also comes from a sense of not belonging in the first place. And so, yeah.
Before we move on, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
In terms of queer fashion, is that contemporary, or is that a long-standing thing? Because, just like with cuffing, it was so ubiquitous starting in the 50s with motorcycle gang movies and things like that. And I'm not saying that it wasn't representative then. I'm just unaware. I'll plead ignorance. Is this a of the moment thing, or is this a long-standing thing for any of them, not just cuffing?
I would argue for cuffing that definitely it probably started as just a greater societal fashion trend, back in the 50s. People might have cuffed before, but that's my first memory. And then I think it was adopted by the queer community. Probably in the 70s, you would start to see people cuff. And then it came back in the 90s big time. And now we're back around again. Just like every fashion trend, it kind of has resurgences within the greater community. But also I think its meaning has changed, like Sonia said, I'm not bi, but I cuff, right? But if you were cuffing in the 90s or in the late 70s, early 80s, you were, it was more of a signifier than it is now, So everything goes through evolutions. Yeah.
I think it does definitely depend on what it is. I think, just thinking like in terms of like TikTok and millennials and generations younger than us, I think there's definitely new inventive things coming up. And I think there always will be. And I think there always will be an adaptation, I guess, light cuffing that comes from history and is adopted. I think the other thing to mention is, some of these things are some aspects of queer fashion, I think, are a lot of like subverting. So taking something out of that context that it once was and putting it in a new context and making it, queer. So for example, maybe somebody that's identifies as a woman dressing a little bit more masculine. If you think about, like the 20s, 30s, when women started wearing pantsuits and things like that, that was an iconic sort of thing for some queer women in queer spaces to be wearing more masculine clothing. And that's kind of the start of that, because prior to that, most women were wearing dresses.
So you make a statement. You're saying something by adopting pants, especially when it's out of your time.
Mm-hmm. So. Not to belabor the point, but because I am a pop culture junkie, Sonia, you'd said there are things that are upcoming. That aren't like what are some? I mean, I can't think of any other way to put it, but what are some upcoming queer fashion trends? And not to be like, I don't know, is that too a weird question?
No, I don't think so. I'm trying to think. I would say a newer-ish one, maybe like colored hair. I think, maybe that's started more in the 90s. But I would say colored hair. I think cuffing is relatively new in terms of specifically bisexual.
Yeah.
Like a bisexual like canon type thing. I would also say dad shirts, I think, are a big thing, especially like when women wear them, kind of seen as a little bit more mask, a little bit more playing with gender type of thing.
There's a lot more, the younger generations, younger than I am, there's a lot more flexibility in the masc to femme playing of clothes. There's a lot less rigidity. I would say that the young people who are queer, who I see, are very often breaking all the norms and wearing a variety of things which we would traditionally see as masculine and feminine. And I think that is a new thing that's happening, definitely. And I would say, like in the drag community, a newer thing that's now becoming coming up and coming is drag queens with facial hair, drag queens with body hair. That used to be a really rigid set of rules around that in the drag community, and now drag queens have facial hair, they have body hair, they're keeping their body hair, and they're being embraced. So that's a very new thing.
I also think women and femme people having body hair is also a relatively new thing, in terms of, being more free and accepting and willing.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I will move on. I will move to the next slide, because unfortunately I really could talk about this for the entirety of the program, but I won't.
Yeah. I mean, I am a fashion historian, like buff. I love learning about fashion and fashion history, but I'm more focused on like 1800s, early 1900s. So that's probably not as interesting to most people. Yeah.
Well, if anyone has any questions about that specific period, please ask them. So I'll move on to the next slide. Oh, I just jumped the gun on question and answer time. All right. I will just pop myself back in just briefly, because when you were talking about fashion, I was in college in the 80s, and everything was so very androgynous in the 80s until the AIDS crisis came along, and kind of everything just kind of screeched to a halt. Like everything you're talking, I remember George Michael, with his the whole look with the pearls on his leather coat instead of chains, and things like that. And I didn't know from anything. I'll be honest. I didn't realize that was, an indicator. I just assumed everyone, I don't know, was androgynous, I guess. I didn't assign any sort of sexuality to it, or choices to it. But it was very interesting to me. I was in Europe when Boy George and Adam Ant were, blowing up on the scene, and it was just fascinating to someone who had grown up in Manitowoc and was 17, and all of a sudden it's like, oh well, look what there is in the world, because I didn't have cable when I left. I didn't have music videos or anything, so it was just wild. So anyway, let's move on to some questions. I'm going to take myself out of the picture again, and I'm actually going to take the PowerPoint out and put the focus back on you guys with some questions that we had received prior to our beginning tonight. And if anyone wants to join in on anything that we're talking about, or perhaps things that we haven't even touched on yet, but let's start with some questions that we have received earlier. First one, what does it mean to belong? Since that's right there in our title, you touched on it a little bit with all the queer fashion and iconography and everything. Can you expand on it some more?
Sure. I think that there's having a sense of belonging is like one step further than inclusion, even then. I think there's I heard an interesting thing, which is that, if there's a difference between, being included in something, say in the workplace, right? So, people are focusing on DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I heard recently that some places are adding belonging because to be included in something is different than having a sense of belonging. Like you belong in that space, like you're welcome in that space, like you feel at home in that space. That's a step further even than inclusion. So belonging is feeling comfortable in the space that you're in and feeling like you're a valuable addition to it and you are a part of it. And so that was interesting to learn that.
Yeah, I think you really need to be welcome, like as you are. You don't need to make any changes to make yourself belong.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that a little bit, I think belonging also, it doesn't necessarily come easy. I think there's sometimes a lot of work that is put into making a space feel like you belong, or making an environment feel like you belong. I think about places that I frequent and the difference that I feel in like feeling like I can talk about queer things, and if somebody overhears me, I'm not going to, get any pushback or negativity back to me. And so I think I'm just trying to point out a little bit that that it's definitely work, and it's definitely something that I think only queer people are in terms of queer people belonging. I think only queer people can really identify when they feel like they belong and where.
But I would say everyone, can experience a sense of belonging in whatever space that they're in. I mean, if you think of, the way that you feel, at work with acquaintances or with work colleagues that you may get along with, but do they know you to the extent where you feel confident that you can be yourself, and you feel like as if you belong in that space? Or are you being included because it's a cordial space, it's a work environment, and everyone's kind? I think that there are different levels there. What Sonia said, when we walk into a space, like, how do you feel? Do you feel like safe, like you're comfortable and you can walk in as you are, or do you feel like you need to hold back a little bit or be careful. And I think that's not unique to the queer community. I think that BIPOC community probably has a lot of similar feelings about belonging versus inclusion. And as does everybody. If somebody who wasn't used to coming into a library or wasn't comfortable with that kind of thing would come in, what does it take for them to feel a sense of belonging? I mean, the staff are going to be kind and welcoming, and they could feel included in whatever activity they're doing, but to feel a sense of belonging and ownership of that community, of that space, and being a part of things is different.
Do you think it also includes, like, not just being invited, the inclusion part of it, but that what you do is actually brought into the mix of the larger picture of what is going on? Is that part of it as well?
I think the sense of value is a part of that. You feel like you're valued in that space. That I think that contributes to a sense of overall belonging.
And I think being heard,
Mm-hmm.
being heard and recognized, definitely.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next question, which is, why do identities matter? Which is something we haven't really touched on tonight. It doesn't seem like.
No, I don't.
Maybe I'm wrong.
No, we kind of went over some identities. We didn't talk about them too much. I'll say the conversation that I had with my mother, which is that she asked, she said, why does it matter? Why do the labels matter? Right? Why does it matter? If you can just be yourself, and why does it really matter? And I said, it's really important when you aren't sure, when you feel that there's something different about you and you aren't sure what that is, to be able to find a label, to be able to find your identity and your sense of belonging within those identities is a really powerful thing, because the more you understand yourself, the more that you can, feel comfortable and you can move through the world with confidence. And I said, it's powerful to be able to have those self-identifiers. And I said, when someone else identifies you and puts a label on you, that can be harmful, because they don't have your consent to do that. But you finding your label, your identity that feels comfortable to you is a powerful thing. So.
And I think just to add to that, I think like 2 points, if I can remember after I make the first point. But the first point being that I think it's also fair to point out that there are some people that don't use labels, that that's empowering to them. And that's totally awesome too. It, like, if you don't want to identify as something, that's totally fine. I think the other thing is it going back to belonging, right? So a sense of like, there's a name for this. I'm not the only person that's experiencing this thing, or maybe feels this way, or whatever it might be.
Yes, community.
For sure, a sense of community. And one example that I can think of that's sometimes interesting within the queer community itself is, like, I identify as bisexual, but there's also pansexual, which pretty, like, they have the same meaning, and I wasn't brought up with the word pansexual. It's not like I don't like the word, or like if somebody referred to me as that, I would be upset. That wouldn't be the case, but I just more strongly identify with the word bisexual, so that's what I use. Also, just another point to point out is, like, in the beginning we kind of went over terminology, and some of these things had gender sort of assigned to them, like gay or lesbian. But I also just want to point out that people can be any gender and also label themselves as gay, lesbian, or any other sexuality. And lastly, sorry, why do identities matter? I think, like I said, belonging, identifying with something and having a word for it. I think different people have different levels of how much it matters to them and how much they, want to project that into the world, or have other people know. But I think they matter because they can be a really helpful thing for people, and making their lives better or easier. So yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that it's identities are really part of who you are, and it's how we see ourselves. So I think that's crucial in this conversation.
Well, I agreed. Just on the surface of it, you don't hear identity in pop culture almost anymore except for secret identity. And if you need a secret identity, well, then why don't you need identities? Identifiers. So, okay. All right. Well, then, let's. I like this next question just because I find it humorous a little bit. Why are there so many letters in the acronym? Maybe it's just the words put together that way, but I mean, it's obvious, but also why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does have some humor to it, right? I mean, I think even within the queer community, sometimes sometimes that's why we use the word queer, is because it's so much simpler than saying LGBTQIA plus, and people often stumble over that, and it's kind of understandable as to why. I mean, there are a lot of letters. There's a really great TikTok out there that somebody says LGBTQ, which I think is just hilarious. but I mean, I think it just grew over time, honestly, and it just, out of wanting to be as inclusive as possible, letters just kept getting added.
Do you think there's a point where it will just collapse under the weight of being all inclusive? I don't mean that negatively. I just
No.
mean like because with emerging identities and
I suspect that that words like queer, that are all encompassing of all of those identities in the community, will probably become more and more common, just because of efficiency. But I think that, like this question points out, why are there so many letters? I think that I've had conversations with people before about this. They just don't get it, right? And I always say, well, it's not for you to get. It's the identities that people have found for themselves that feel right to them. And I don't know all of the identities, and I don't understand all of the identities, but that's not my job. So I think that there will come a time when there are a lot and very few people. Only Wikipedia will be able to keep track of them. But I think that they're valid, and I think that I would not support knocking off letters or starting to hack it up, because I think that the core of it all is that is that identities are, people are seen, that their identities are seen. But I agree with you on the one end. It'll become enormous, and then we'll just always say queer or something else. Maybe there'll be a new term.
Well, I mean, does queer kind of become the NATO of identities, or the United Nations of identity? Well, United Nations isn't an acronym. That in fact is two words. But something like NATO, or I mean, is that essentially? Is it an equivalent? Almost, because there are always countries being added into NATO's. There are new identities being added on. Maybe I'm over.
I love the comparison to NATO, Tim, because I love politics, but but I do think, like, even amongst the three of us, when we're hanging out as friends and talking about things in a non necessarily serious way or whatever, most of the time we're using the word queer. We're not using the word or the acronym LGBTQIA+. It's just so much simpler. And I do want to point out too that some people are uncomfortable with the term queer, because there still is some of that derogatory hurt from history, of people being called queer in not a good way. But I firmly believe in the reclaiming of the word queer, and utilizing it and making it ours again.
Is it okay for cis people to use queer?
Yes.
In an affirming way, of course.
Well, right. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's how you use it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But I mean, it's not like verboten.
No, I would say that is a word that that the greater community can use as long as it's being used in an affirming way. That's kind of a code for when somebody uses that in an affirming way, that that they're cool, that that they're okay, they're probably pretty safe.
Right.
I think it's also a little bit of hinting towards like, okay, like I kind of know that they're like in the know a little bit, of like more queer culture type of things, or they're just younger people, because usually younger people are using the term queer.
That makes me feel so much younger than I am. But all right. Anything else to add into this? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question.
Bring on the next one.
All right. And I like that. It's kind of whiplash inducing, but who's your favorite drag queen?
National drag queen. My favorite drag queen is Jinx Monsoon, who was pictured earlier in the slide, because I like a good comedy queen, and she has excellent timing. She's very funny, and she's a good singer, and she's the whole package, and she's hilarious. Local queens, I like JoJo Jubilee. She performs in Green Bay. She performs in Appleton and in Madison. She's a good queen.
I would say that there's too many that I like, but if I'm for going locally, I would definitely say JoJo. She has a special place for us.
Yeah, for me, I love Violet Chachki, mostly because, again, I love fashion, and she's a major fashion queen. One thing about also some more drag queen queer culture is that drag queens sometimes will have like certain things that they're more attuned to or more about. Like example, Violet Chachki is more of a fashion queen. But I do love Jinx Monsoon because she's hilarious. She's talented all around. I've gotten to see her in person.
If you're listening, you're welcome for the plug.
yeah, Jinx Monsoon, please contact us. We would love to hang out with you. If you're watching this, Manitowoc, library thing. But yeah, and as for local queens, again, JoJo is great. Lola here in Manitowoc is great. I love anytime that we're able to see or support local queens.
Cool. I'm a big, I guess I'm also old school. I know all the people you're talking about. My favorite still is Divine. But I don't even know if that counts, because
she was a drag queen. She was one of the originals.
But she was also more of a performance artist too.
She was dramatic, Tim.
Oh, she was, and dangerous. And I saw her at a club perform in Milwaukee back in the day, and most of it was done on a trampoline.
Oh gosh!
Oh,
and
that's amazing.
It was amazing and fascinating, and I still haven't seen anything the equivalent. But I mean, she was incredible. But I just never know if she was more a performance artist than a drag queen.
Drag queens are performance artists. Definitely.
Do you think just across the board?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think of them as performers.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think it's
Okay.
both. Yeah.
I don't know of many who will just eat dog poop off the street. Though.
Well, she was in it for the shock value.
Oh,
Definitely.
for sure.
Yeah.
Tim, I think in order for you to be a true ally, you have to let us do divine makeup on you.
Oh,
But I don't have to shave, right? As
No,
you were saying,
no.
now the beards are being more facial
Beards are
hairs.
fine.
we'll just
Yeah.
put sparkles in it.
Like I haven't worn makeup before or sparkles. Come on. Sure. I mean, just show up. We can just turn the camera on me and we can have a Tim Divine makeover evening with the rest of the night. So,
That
of
would be
course I'd
amazing.
do that. I would do that. That's easy. That's an easy one. All right. But I'm sure people don't necessarily want to hear about that right now. So next question is, what do I do if I don't know someone's pronouns? Once again, a little whiplash inducing coming off of the drag queen question. But what should you do?
Well, the most obvious thing is ask. It's not pretty easy to just ask, but you can also use they, them. That's pretty neutral to use for somebody. Yeah.
An easy way to ask is, or imply that you would like to know, is when you introduce yourself to someone, tell them your pronouns. You know,
Yeah.
and then they'll be like, oh, you would like to know, and so they. But as long as you're asking in a way that's respectful, most people, especially people that use alternate pronouns or pronouns that may not be obvious, really appreciate being asked. And if you get someone's pronouns wrong, the best thing that we would love for you to do is just apologize really quickly and continue through the conversation, because attention is uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think sitting there and purposely apologizing, it then becomes a burden on the person that you misgendered, and you don't want that to be. Just correct yourself and move on, and that's about it.
And we just have one more question. So if you're following along and have any questions, please toss them into the mix. But our last question that we have at this moment is, how can I be a good ally?
The best way to be a good ally is to be an active ally, and to support the kind of legislation that's happening that supports queer people, to support the kind of things that support being inclusive, to the best. I really appreciate the allies who are willing to stand up in those spaces where it's not always safe, or not always it's overwhelming maybe for the queer community, for a good ally to show up in those spaces, in those difficult situations, and to speak out for the queer community. I would say that's the number one thing I appreciate about a good ally.
I think another part of it is to make sure you listen to what the community is saying and not speak over them. If they want to speak, make sure that you can help raise their voices too.
I think the other thing is I think right now there's a lot of things going on in the U.S. in terms of the queer community and things that are affecting the queer community. And I think it, for some people, has caused them to distance themselves from queer issues. And I think as an ally, not distancing yourself and, being supportive and still showing support even when things are really difficult and maybe there's more pushback than there has been. I think times like these are times when the queer community could use allies the most, is when there's a lot of things going on.
Well, I think that is a good, since we don't have any questions that have come in, I think that's a good stopping point. Unless there is anything else that you would like to add, any three of you would like to add.
Thank you, everybody, for watching, and thank you, Tim and his team, for continuing to invite us in and have great conversations. I definitely enjoy it.
We appreciate you guys.
Oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate that you guys come on and, are always so open and candid, and the conversations are always fantastic, and you don't mind when I just abruptly jump back into the picture like that. But no, I love these conversations, and I think they're so important to have, and not just during, with the people watching it, but they also get a lot of archival views too, and I love that it goes forward from the point. But that is going to wrap it up for tonight. I know for sure we have one more program coming up in November. One more discussion coming up. It sounds like there may be a day of beauty for me in the works. That I'm not shy. So, but thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thank you everyone for engaging in this conversation. And on behalf of Manitowoc Public Library and Lakeshore's United Visionaries, thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for the conversation. Have a great night, everyone. Bye.